We're going to start. My name is Vaughan Smith, and I'd like to welcome you to the Frontline Club. We've got an incredible panel for you here. We've absolutely reached to the top shelf to get Dorothy Byrne, who is head of Channel 4's News and Current Affairs. She started her career in World in Action, and so we're incredibly lucky to have her here. We couldn't be in better hands, so I'm going to hand over to her now.
Thank you very much, Vaughan. Actually, I started my career in the Waltham Forest Guardian. It's much less exciting. So, as Vaughan says, we have an extraordinary panel tonight. But before I introduce the panel or we start, I want to show a film. Are you ready for that, Vaughan?
Yes.
Jump to it. And if for younger people who may not have seen this footage before, it's very harrowing footage from Bosnia, and afterwards Ed will explain some of the context to it. I just want to warn you.
The Bosnian Serbs don't call a massacre a concentration camp. Come in, they challenged ITN, and see it for yourselves. Under Serbian armed guard for our own protection, a 3-day journey ended here, at the gates of a disused mine in northern Bosnia. Here we were shown only several hundred of the 2,500 prisoners, all Muslim men, at or massacre, we were told, to be interrogated. Those found guilty of fighting Serbs were then sent to prisoner of war camps, the innocents to refugee camps. This is all we saw of the prisoners and of a massacre itself. They never spoke. The only voices, those of the guards ordering them to eat faster and leave. How are you treated? What are the conditions, I asked. I don't want to tell lies. I can't speak the truth. Thank you for coming. We were told that the army does not control a massacre. These prisoners are the responsibility of the civil authorities and local militia. We sought an explanation from the camp commandant.
Would you describe this as a prison camp, a transit camp, or a refugee camp?
No, this is not a camp, this is a center. The transit center. Omarska and Ternopil, both the centers, not camps.
And then the men left, back to wherever they'd come from, away from our cameras and questions, hidden from the United Nations and the Red Cross, who've been denied access to a massacre, hidden until now from the world. We were not allowed to follow them to their living accommodation, what appeared to be the larger of the two buildings, to see the other 2,000 detainees and how they live.
What's your reason? Just trying to do my best here. What's your reason? To show us where they live.
When Dr. Cavendish,
well.
why are you not fulfilling Dr. Cavendish's promise to us?
He promised us something else and said, you can do this and that and not that.
We've seen nothing. We've seen one dining hall, 80 prisoners.
And so we left, our hosts fulfilling their promise to show us the second camp, Tribunals, where 2,000 refugees are living. We were not prepared for what we saw and heard there.
How long has he been here?
Several hundred said that they'd arrived from a massacre that morning or from another detention camp, released to this refugee centre after days, sometimes months of interrogation. We asked if the allegations of beating in the detention centres were true.
So much about that. I think people were hungry. True.
I'm not sure that I'm allowed about that. You know, can you understand me?
Tell us the truth.
I'm afraid. 200
What happened? In this vicious civil war, where atrocities against Serbs as well as Muslims occur daily, finding the truth isn't easy. We ourselves saw no evidence of beatings on any refugee here, and we only heard the allegations. Allegations even the camp doctor seemed unable to substantiate in front of our Serb hosts.
Does he get any cases here of people who've been beaten from the other camp?
Imate slučaj da su bili neki koji su tučeni u drugom kampu, recimo provedeni od takvih. Yes.
Many?
Da ih ima mnogo i...
Should be happy speaking in our language?
Yes.
I was able, however, to smuggle out a roll of film, and the man who took these pictures and gave it to me said he would be killed if caught. He begged me to check that in 3 days he was still alive. And amongst all this horror, some small touches of humanity.
This is my friend.
Like 19-year-old Igor, a Serb, who now stands guard over the friends he grew up with. Muslims from the village they once shared as children, now homeless, persecuted, and behind wire. Igor took us to another side of Chanyapoli, where we met some who'd come here by choice, those who'd run for their lives to this pitiable camp. Amongst them 13-year-old Sana, who said he was used as a human shield by extremist Muslims on his own side. The Serbs had taken his mother.
Frightened.
It's just much. It's
Or more?
Yes, yes.
Where do you want to be? If you could shut your eyes and be anywhere, where would you like to be?
Kad bi ovako zažmurio, kad bi poželao negdje da odem, gdje bi ovdje otišao?
Volio bi odem za majku, tamo za rođenje.
To follow my mother, to find my mother, where is she?
No one we spoke to knew why they'd been brought here, whether they were prisoners, refugees, or what lay in store for them. In this civil war, there is no sense, and a great deal of horrifying cruelty. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Northern Bosnia.
So, many of you sitting here tonight might think that if you were a journalist and you'd seen terrible things like that, you would automatically give evidence in a court if the court asked you to. But many leading journalists, or some leading journalists perhaps I should say that a journalist should never give evidence to an international criminal court. That for us to give evidence means that we cease to be the reporters of the story and we have become part of the story, and also by losing our due impartiality we put other journalists at risk. And I tell you that now because we don't have somebody here tonight representing that point of view, but I want you to keep that perspective in your mind just as you keep that footage in your mind. We have here with us tonight 3 journalists who decided that they would give evidence, and I'm going to come to them in a moment and they're going to tell us why they gave evidence and their experience of it. And then we're very fortunate indeed, and I believe you may be the first judge that has ever stepped over the Frontline's doorstep. And also, I quite like the fact that I'm up here with the judge, because usually I'm down there in trouble. So we have...
you may still be.
We have the Right Honourable Lord Justice Adrian Fulford, who is England and Wales' most senior presiding judge, who was elected to serve as the UK's judge before the International Criminal Court for a term of 9 years, assigned to the trial division. And I'll just tell you now, he feels passionately we should give evidence. And then we also have with us, very fortunately, Wayne Jordash QC, Managing Partner at Global Rights Compliance, who has served as an advocate in the international criminal proceedings before the ICC, and he's more ambivalent. And I'm telling you this to give you the idea that this is not simple what we're talking about tonight. And then finally we have with us Wendy Betts, who's the director of Eyewitness to Atrocities, who's going to tell us all a bit later in the discussion about a fantastic new tool available to journalists and human rights activists to gather proper evidence of atrocities. But first I want to come to Ed Biliami, a former colleague. And Ed, I think most of you will know, one of our most revered journalists who worked not only on World in Action, but for many years on The Guardian and The Observer, and who gave evidence to the core about the atrocities that in Bosnia. So Ed, I would like you to tell us why you decided to give evidence, and perhaps give a little context at the beginning for younger people who might not know about Bosnia, and a little bit about your experience.
Thanks very much. And thanks for coming. Don't revere me, for God's sake.
Only review you.
Of course. The context, yeah, well, I mean, the night after we found the camps, one of the senior kind of executives of what we now know to be the genocidal machine the Bosnian Serbs described it all as happening only 200 kilometers from Venice, which kind of puts it in place geographically. He's absolutely right, it was. And historically, in terms of why testify, that's not 8 minutes to history of the Bosnian War. I mean, the timeline's important. That was August 1992. Not everybody at the age of 39 gets to walk into a concentration camp. Those buildings that we couldn't get into were, as the ICTY has since affirmed, and we kind of had an awful feeling at the time, were indeed places where mass murder, torture, mutilation, and killing was going on. Above us in the canteen were the rooms where the women were kept for violation every night and all night by the beasts you saw in uniform. It was, the thing about Bosnia is always presume the worst. You'll be right. Ternopil has been some arguments whether it was a concentration camp or a death camp. It was basically a concentration camp in the original British sense of the term in South Africa. It was where people were basically concentrated for mass deportation, and while they were there, mutilated, murdered, raped, and so on, many of them. But the context is this: that was August 1992. And when people talk about the power of the media, I don't think so. We reported to the best of our ability, myself, I was one of the many people who did a better job than me, 3 effing years of carnage, ethnic cleansing, the siege and torture of Sarajevo, on it went, and the politicians and the diplomats did, at best, they did nothing, at worst they were complicit in the crimes. The massacre at Srebrenica, which happened at 8,000 men and boys over 5 days, was 3 years after that. So in a way, why testify? I mean, out of complete exhausted frustration, basically. The reporting had achieved nothing, to be honest, to be brutal about it. I mean, I admire and respect many colleagues who think that we do a grand job and we make a difference, etc., etc. I didn't notice that in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And to be honest, I just thought, look, anything to we can't rectify that situation, but just anything. It was called the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, set up in The Hague as an act of kind of, apparently I'm told, as a result of these pictures when they were seen by, well, maybe she heard my story too, Madeleine Albright in the United States. Well, if so, we might a commission on the salaries earned thereafter. But no, that's another matter. I elected to testify in the first trial, which was that of a kind of parish punk sadist called Dusan Tadic, who was a torturer and a murderer in the second camp, Ternopil. And people said, oh, why go to all this effort to try and parish pump sadist and murderer and rapist? Well, actually, it's quite a good place to start because it was an intimate war. The macabre intimacy. We saw the boy meeting with his friend from the football team. I mean, the thing, one of the survivors of a massacre said to me afterwards, that this was not Auschwitz, but that one of the differences was that the people who, took the Hungarians off the train and down the ramp into the gas ovens didn't really know who they were. We were tortured, murdered, raped, and mutilated by our maths teachers, by the pupils in school, by the people with whom we played football, and that's where the world kind of imploded. The weird thing is, of course, I kept in touch with these people. The man who said, I don't want to tell any lies, but I cannot tell the truth, is called Jim Tushisha. He walks into a room in 2008. I nearly fell off my chair. He lives in Bournemouth Wood for a sod, as if he hadn't suffered enough. Fikret Alish, the man behind the barbed wire, is hilarious, man. It's terribly funny. I asked him, Fikret, how did you survive? He says, I survived because I am a man who can laugh. Boy, can he. But his brother is a complete mental nervous wreck. He's in a sort of hex. He gets up every morning and talks about the camps, and he goes to sleep and gets up the next day and does it all again. The psychiatrist can't break into that. So that's why I testified basically to these people, and it was very weird. There were philosophical points too, just briefly, because they're not actually as interesting. Objectivity and neutrality, to me, they're not the same thing. Objectivity is fact-specific. There's 8 bodies in a burned-out house. It's 8 bodies, not 12 because they're certain, or 6 because they're Bolshevik, or 3 because they're crap. Neutrality is another thing. It's a moral judgment. I don't want to be neutral between the women who were violated above the canteen you've just seen and the men who were doing it. I'm not, and I would never be. Roy Gutman, esteemed, estimable, marvellous colleague, John Randall, greater reporter, says, don't do it, Ed. You're compromising your neutrality. You're compromising your sort of distance as the fourth estate from all this. To which I say, well, hey, we're citizens. Who elected this priesthood? If you see an old lady being mugged on the street by skinheads, and the police ask you to testify, do you say, no, I can't, I work for the Guardian. Sorry, you'll have to ask the ticket collector at the station. It's an absurdity. So there's that. But so I just went along, and I ended up getting sort of sucked into this sort of thing called the ICTY, which began quite lean and idealistic, and it's sort of, rather got more and more sort of bulimic and obese and slow as it went along, and the salaries kind of went exponentially up. One of the interesting things is money with these courts. Refugees start out poor, most of them by definition, most of them end up poor. They're not stupid, they can see this business going on that international laws become. These are other considerations. But the main thing for me was, I have to do it for the people you've seen on that film, with whom I've kept in touch ever since, for 25 years. We're his friends. One day I want to have a summer holiday that isn't at the commemoration of the Omarska concentration camp. I'm sick of it going back. So you do it for them. And it was very weird meeting in the Bel Air Hotel breakfast room for those early trials, when these people who you've seen behind the wire in the camp would sort of pick rather nervously, still at that point of their kind of spread cheese and ham, and a good Dutch breakfast. It got very strange. Testifying, and Jackie and Shay got to testify, talk about this later, we were accused of grandstanding. In fact, Jackie was specifically accused of grandstanding by the New York Times in a wretched article. Grandstanding, I don't think so. It's terrifying. When the court adjourns and you're still on the stand and you're going to do it all again tomorrow, under cross-examination from a lawyer who's there as much to defend the cause as the client, you don't sleep. You go through it all again and you churn it over. If it's like that for people like me, what must it be like for the violated women and the tortured and mutilated survivors of the camps who come forward to do this? I think I'm going to stop soon, but just at the end, would I do it again? I'm not sure. It takes a very, very large chunk out of your life doing this. Did the ICTY achieve anything? I don't know, to be honest. But I think it did historically. I mean, legally, yeah, it's better that these guys are in prison than not, I suppose. I'm not sure whether they're in jail in Turkey or Alabama or in Sweden, which equivalent movies and playing tennis with their adversaries, which is what they do most of the time. But I think the historical thing was the main thing for me. If you do want to go into the archives of the ICTY, the story there is told. We were operating in difficult circumstances at the time, since I've written a book which is basically about the survivors of the camps. But journalism is journalism with its limitations. When those people go into court, when they lose money driving trucks around, and they come from their shit zero-hour jobs in Harlem or Stuttgart to testify, they tell the story. It's there. The historical record is there. In a way, I think that is the achievement of the tribunal. It had a very weird extra-legal brief, which our legal friends know more about than I do, which is to promote reconciliation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's not actually a legal. That's not the job of a court. In that, of course, it's failed. Utterly one of the sort of depressing things about Bosnia-Herzegovina is that it's now sort of settled back into the comfort of hatred. Everybody is much better off hating each other. It's actually more lucrative to carry on hating each other because you get 3 times as much money as you would otherwise. So would I do it again? I don't know, but I know why I did it at the time.
Can I ask you one practical question? How long did it all take, and what sort of help, advice, support did you get from your employer and from the court? Was it how many weeks or months of your life? I mean, how did it affect?
Oh, there was a period, Dorothy, when I was spending more time working with the ICTY than for the Observer. I mean, for every hour on the stand, as you gentlemen know, a unit differently, maybe more. I mean, for every hour on the stand is 10 of prep, getting it right, figuring it out. Never mind, I've got a lot of air miles.
And how many hours were you on the stand?
I don't know, gosh, I haven't thought about that. It was 9 trials, 5 days, some of them 3 days, others 1 morning, others. I mean, it's scores of hours. Support from the paper, absolute. Jackie can address this later, but I mean, yeah, they were fantastic. So full pay, and he's testifying in court. And here's yet another letter to say that we really scared to do this. They were fantastic. Unanimous. Support from the legal staff varies with the lawyers. Some of them I really want to meet again. Others were fantastic. Some of them, I worked with people there who knew more about, who cared more about Bosnia than a lot of the reporters and the NGOs, to be honest.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. And now I'm going to turn to Jackie Rowland, who was also in Bosnia for the BBC.
Well, I wasn't actually Bosnia, it was Serbia and Kosovo.
Oh, sorry, right, I'm going to let you describe it all for yourself. So I'm going to ask Jackie to stand up and speak to you. There just wasn't enough room on the stage.
Hi everyone, I'm Jackie Rowland, and I'm not sure if this is working. If it's not, I'll just project. I was working for the BBC in Serbia and Kosovo. Is it working or not?
No, I'm sorry. Why don't I attend to that while you project?
Should I just project? Maybe I'll just...
Yeah, come up and project.
Oh, actually, thank you. I was talking to this. That works, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay. Right. I won't find it. Yeah. So I was the BBC Belgrade correspondent during the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, which followed, again, a very brief history lesson, human rights abuses against the Albanian civilian population in Kosovo, and ultimately the Yugoslav army and the Serbian police were given an ultimatum to stop doing this or get out. Otherwise, NATO eventually, as we all know, decided to carry out a bombing campaign in early 1999 to enforce various resolutions regarding an end to those activities in Kosovo. And I was Belgrade correspondent at the time, and partly during the NATO intervention, I was actually in Kosovo itself, and our daily routine involved going out to various sites which had been bombed by NATO to investigate what the site was and what had happened. On one occasion, I visited a prison in the town of Istok, a prison which had been bombed, and where we saw some disturbing sights, piles of bodies of prisoners, and also prisoners lined up against the wall at gunpoint. There was something very not right about this prison. It was very disturbing, and I reported on it at the time. And it was the reports that I filed that day for the BBC, which were what prompted the prosecutor's office of the ICTY to get in touch with me. They wanted my testimony to complement a testimony that they had of one of the prisoners who was actually in the prison and witnessed shooting. It would appear that I saw the aftermath, so I wasn't a person who could actually witness events that had happened. However, my testimony of what I saw, if you like, reinforced and amplified the testimony of the prisoner. Now, I think the reason that my testimony got such a lot of attention was because it was actually as part of the prosecution evidence in the trial of Slobodan Milosevic. So it's a very high profile, probably apart from Karadzic and Mladic, probably the most high profile trial that took place in the ICTY. And of course, what added to the sort of dramatic, if you like, melodramatic aspect of it was that Milosevic himself decided to carry out his own defence. So there were not lawyers who were questioning me, but Milosevic himself. Now, my evidence in chief was given as a written statement, which was part of the procedure of the court in order to try to save time, because that was another problem with these trials, the fact they'd gone on for years and years and years. However, I was cross-examined, so my evidence in chief was taken as a statement by a prosecution, an investigator within the prosecutor's office, and was presented in written form to the court, and then I was cross-examined by Milosevic. Now, to be honest with you, it didn't strike me as particularly controversial at the time, the idea that I should give evidence, for much the same reasons as Ed described, in that, you know, if you're approached by a prosecuting authority or police, if you've witnessed a potential crime, it seems to me a civic duty to, and I've testified in other trials, and I've testified as a defence witness in a criminal case in Paris, you know. Also, the other reason why I didn't feel that it was such a difficult decision to take was because the testimony was already in the public domain. It was essentially to go back into court and give that sworn document describing those events which were in my reports that I filed in March, April, May 99. I think it was May 99. I wasn't quite prepared for the kind of way in which I was taken apart afterwards by some of the usual suspects in the press who took me apart. What was particularly difficult for me was that, unlike Ed, I didn't really receive that support. I was essentially on my own. So I went to The Hague on my own. I didn't have any sort of BBC manager or anyone with me. I didn't get any advice from any BBC lawyers. I was just on my own. I did have a couple of conversations with them, and one was that I shouldn't submit any expenses. And that was about it. And I remember on the day that I was actually testifying, they put out a press release. And in the press release, they distanced themselves from what I was doing. This was Jackie's decision, nothing to do with us, which vultures were swirling. And I should just say now, this is the first time I've spoken in public on this issue for 16 years. Because I was so kind of... I just didn't want to talk about it for a long time. Can
I ask you, what do you think of the fact that Milosevic, you know, what was that like, Milosevic cross-examining you? I mean, if we are saying to people here, you might end up in a court, that is a horrible.
Well, yes, I mean, it was grueling. I mean, it was interesting how Ed was describing, you know, the atmosphere at the, I can't remember the name of the hotel that I was staying in, but you know, you wake up in the morning, you open the curtains, and out across the courtyard, you see the ICTY, and you know that within a matter of hours you're going to be in there. What was worse for me was that I was expecting to be on at 1 afternoon, and so from about 1:30 I was sitting in the waiting area, you know, kind of, you know, my intestines churning for about an hour and a half, only to be told, oh, there's only some. Actually, I think I was brought into the courtroom, and then I was told, actually, there's not enough time now, will you come back tomorrow morning? So having hyped myself, I had to go back the next morning. Didn't sleep very well, couldn't eat breakfast. It wasn't so bad once I got in there and got going, but I was cross-examined for an hour and a half, and essentially what Milosevic was trying to do, he decided that he was going to use this process in his own way. He wasn't, if you like, playing by the rules of, you know, I had a report that covered a number of matters of fact and statistics and dates. He wasn't going to cross-examine me on those statistics and dates. He was going to do his own thing. He was essentially putting the international community, Western politicians, the Western media, etc., on trial. So he wasn't defending himself. He was almost carrying out his own prosecution against other people. And so he used that hour and a half or so that I was in the court.
And the court didn't stop him from doing
Well, no, I think there was one occasion, I think, when the judge, Richard Mace, sort of had to stop him and saying that he was going off down but essentially he was asking questions that sought to undermine my objectivity, my credibility, and to undermine the BBC. And, you know, at one stage he asked about the BBC's objectivity, and I said, whatever, and his just quip afterwards was I explained that what I'd done. His remark was, one swallow does not make a spring. Or at least that's how it's translated into my head.
So you've got Milosevic attacking you in the court. Tell us a little bit more about why other journalists attack you outside and what they said and what that felt like to be attacked by your own profession when you're doing something that's so difficult.
Well, I was attacked. I can't remember the piece in the New York Times, just as well I can't, but I do remember Robert Fisk having a go at me and writing something like, you know, in future wars, you know, you'll have, quote, you know, I'm Jackie Rowland, the BBC correspondent, and if you lose, I'll be testifying you against you in a tribunal, unquote. That was sort of the scenario. I don't believe that, well, I just see it as another way of bearing witness. You know, like Ed was saying, with the reports that he did from Moscow and other places in Bosnia, you know, you're bearing witness to what's happened. You're shining a light in dark places. You're putting things on the record, and I was essentially doing that. You know, you see something, you report what you saw, you report how you understood what you saw or didn't understand what you saw, and you put it out there. And I did that on the radio and on the television. And I did it in the court of law. And I wasn't recounting anything in the trial that was any way kind of privileged information. It was all information that was already in the public domain. I do think that you know, Robert Fisk tends to, I think he likes to take the contrary approach often when he's reporting. I think he likes to, you know, be controversial, be provocative, and, you know, if everyone is saying one thing, he'll say the other almost for the sake of it. So yeah, I mean, he was one of those who was circling for me, but it was difficult. I didn't want to do interviews afterwards. I mean, I was always being asked by academics who were writing PhD theses about international justice, would I give interviews to them? No. I just wanted to put behind me, but I don't regret testifying. And interestingly enough for me, if you like, the denouement for me, the closure, came many years later when I was in Jerusalem working for Al Jazeera by this stage. And I happened to find out that there was a Canadian senior military officer who was working there with an American general on sort of capacity building for the Palestinian Authority forces. And I discovered that he had been among the NATO troops who had gone into Kosovo after the Serbian police and Yugoslav military pulled out, and he had been one of the first to go into Istok prison. And I thought, aha, I need to talk to him. And I did eventually. After some months, I managed to get a breakfast meeting with him. And we talked. And what he told me about what he found in this prison when the NATO forces came in completely vindicated my testimony. He said bodies everywhere, rammed into air conditioning shafts. He said it was just, it was really, really gruesome. And that for me was the closure, because having been torn apart, you end up questioning yourself, questioning your judgment, questioning your motives, questioning what you saw, questioning what you understood you saw. And that meeting that I had, for me, yes, I did understand correctly. This is what happened. But having said that, did it achieve anything? Milosevic died before the end of his trial, so on that particular occasion, there wasn't an outcome in terms of justice being served. But as Ed said, it's on the record, it's there on the historical record. In terms of, I think you're going to ask me about a young journalist who might be asked to testify in the future.
Yeah.
I think that I'm often asked by young people who are interested in getting into journalism, particularly international reporting, for my advice. And my comments are that I feel it's a lot more difficult now than it was when I started out. Partly because when I was a young journalist, any colleagues of mine who were wounded or killed in conflicts that they were covering, it was generally by accident. They got in the crossfire, they got in the way. Whereas now, the journalists, are actively targeted, and I don't see that as being as a result of testifying in tribunals. There are other strategic, geopolitical, games being played here, knowing the lack of appetite in the West for, seeing people, on having to read out statements on the internet, and even worse things that are recorded and put up on the internet. And that is not as a result of, James Foley didn't testify. It's becoming increasingly dangerous, and I do particularly worry in terms of preparing, training, backup equipment, that young people who want to make a start and want to make a name for themselves, I see them going into really dangerous situations, going into Syria, and some of them have been killed, because they feel they have to go somewhere to actually get exposure, and because they don't have the training, the backup, the equipment, they can get killed. And I think that is a terrible price to pay for trying to get into journalism. And with regard to actually testifying, I think ultimately it has to be the same test as with anything else we say. We always used to say that no image is worth an injury, no story is worth a life. If a young journalist in the future felt that they actually would risk being killed as a result of testifying, then that's obviously a very very important consideration. I mean, I received, it wasn't trolling then, because it was just an email. I received an email shortly after testifying from someone who claimed to have been one of the guards at the East Dock prison. He said he remembered the day that I walked around with the other journalists touring the prison after the bombing. He said he had me in his crosshairs as I was walking around. Nice, huh?
Well, there's one last thing that I wanted to ask you about, which was the BBC. I knew that you were going to raise this issue, so I contacted the BBC, both to ask them to comment on this, but also to say, would you like to lay out briefly for the audience tonight what your policy is on supporting your journalists or your freelance journalists who are reporting for you and are then asked to give evidence to a court in this way. And they gave me this very detailed statement. The BBC does provide legal support to our staff when it is appropriate, but we are unable to comment on the specifics of Jackie's case. That was very detailed and illuminating. So may I just ask you what you feel about the level of support that you got, and what you feel employers have a duty to do?
Well, I didn't get any support, that was the bottom line.
And you know why not?
I think it was because, the BBC, I think, was a bit, what do we do now? We've got to be independent, we've got to be neutral, we've got to be balanced, objective, fair, and what do we do? And, nothing to do with us, nothing to do with us. hence the statement that went out saying, you know, it's basically nothing to do with us. Whereas in fact, it wasn't just a personal decision of mine. I wasn't just in Kosovo on a holiday and happened to see this. I was in Kosovo reporting for the BBC. Ergo, the very fact that I witnessed these events was intimately and crucially linked to the fact that I was there as a BBC journalist. So I think it would have been appropriate for me to have had, you know, legal advice preparation, you know, and, you know, maybe as a senior BBC manager to have been with me, you know, to debrief, hold my hand or whatever. I mean, not so long ago, an Al Jazeera colleague of mine was on trial for some minor infraction in Paris, and a manager from London came out just to be there, you know, to hold his hand for something like that. Whereas, you know, the experience that I had was, I'd say, you know, more grave, and it was kind of, they didn't want to know. I think they just wanted it to go away.
Well, look, I think we're very grateful to you, because you said that you hadn't spoken about this before in this way.
Well, not for 16 years.
You know, I for 16 years, and I think we're all really grateful that you've talked. No, thank you very much. The third journalist that we're going to hear from who decided to give evidence is Shay Rhodes, and I should say it was a Channel 4 programme, so I might not attack the employer involved, because I could get difficult, but you can attack me if you want.
Okay.
And I'm not going to say where you were or anything, since I got it wrong last time. So,
I'll come and stand.
Come up.
Behind you. So hi, I'm Shay Rhodes. I was in Ivory Coast in 2011 during what's become known as the Battle for Abidjan, which Abidjan being the capital city. It had been kind of brewing for quite a long time, and I think that I know that when we went to Ivory Coast, we didn't really expect there to be a war while we were there. We thought that there'd probably be one, probably at the end of the year, roughly, you know, because you can predict these things, can't you? So the plan was to show how a country was descending into civil war, what it was like for people surviving, and what services fell apart, and how NGOs have to plug those gaps, and where those gaps are, and how you identify them. And we thought that would all be very interesting. But what happened was this war kind of happened while we were there. So the borders shut down, the airports shut down, no other journalists could get into the country, which meant that this very kind of undercovered country had suddenly, has this died? Cool. I'll hold it very close. This very kind of undercovered country suddenly became the spotlight of everybody's attention. Most people had been thinking about Japan. There was obviously the tsunami in 2011, and then Libya, the whole Gaddafi thing. So that was all kind of taking up people's attention. And so I think Associated Press and Reuters both had teams in Abidjan at the time. Al Jazeera weren't there. The BBC had a correspondent who sort of had lived there for 5 years, was married to a local woman, but he wasn't kind of pumping stuff out actively. And so suddenly this situation kicked off, and whoever was in the country was there, which included us. Myself and Alex, kind of going through a slightly gonzo journalism phase, running around filming everything, and just kind of seeing what happens. And we found ourselves obviously in an amazing position to do that, because everything we filmed was uniquely being filmed by us, and was often historically massively important. Very simple things like a scene of a road became very important because it proved that there were checkpoints at certain locations, checkpoints where people say that their families were subsequently murdered. So it's very important to have proof that that actually existed at any point, and we're the only ones who were there randomly filming everything. Who was manning the checkpoints exactly? We kind of got in and interviewed a lot of those people. They showed us, at one stage they showed us their orders from the army, with lists of names, nationalities and descriptions of individuals who they're supposed to be stopping. These were just kind of local neighbourhood boys. They were drug dealers really, 3 months earlier, and suddenly they were the kind of security force with orders from the army. All of this kind of collusion between the army and these, I don't even know, I want to keep saying militia, but they weren't even militia. They literally were just gangs who had been kind of mobilised for a political purpose. And this all happened very quickly in the capital city. Obviously the eyes are typically on it, there's lots of French journalists around, lots of people who would report if this collusion was too obvious. So it all happened very quickly in that kind of 1 month period when everything shut down, when nobody was looking anymore. And it suddenly became kind of important that we filmed this stuff. Also, as part of it, I should point out that because we're now kind of a development on from where you guys were, which is a point I'll come back to, the local media, the state-run media were very kind of aware of our presence and their role as a kind of the foil, the national foil to our presence as foreign journalists. There's a whole bunch of stuff around the election, who won the election, whether or not the president who had kind of lost the election, or was being told he'd lost, was refusing to accept the results. The result was first announced by a French journalist, and so journalists and foreign journalists in particular became part of this big conspiracy about, you know, were we directing the course of the country and so on and so forth, the kinds of conspiracies that become kind of commonplace nowadays. So we found ourselves intimately involved in what was going on, and at one stage a group of soldiers came into our hotel, which had been locked down for about 4 or 5 days by this point. They kidnapped a businessman who ran Ivory Coast's largest cocoa producer. Ivory Coast well known for producing cocoa. I think they produce about 70% of the country's cocoa. So he was very well known, very rich man. His assistant and a couple of other colleagues of his and their security guard, all of whom turned up dead about 2 weeks later in the lagoon. The thing that really struck me about, or the thing that really stuck with me about that, is that immediately afterwards, all the hotel staff who I'd got to know, we'd been stuck in this hotel for 6 days now, we'd all kind of got to know them very well. They all came up to me individually and told me that those who were in the hotel manager's room at the time when these soldiers came in witnessed an exchange which went along the lines of, that guy there, him, pointing to the screen, the CCTV screen, on which I was running down the corridor, trying to get to what I thought was a safe place. He's a journalist. We know he's a journalist because he's been filmed by state media. His image has been in the newspapers, it's been on state TV, this has been happening for 2 weeks now. So they knew who I was and they wanted me. And the hotel manager said, well, now, hold on now. And essentially gave himself up as a well-known manager of an Accor Group hotel, which, you know, is kind of in there with the French government. And the businessman also, who ran a very lucrative company in the Ivory Coast, also I think assumed that his contacts would get him out of this situation. So they gave themselves up really to protect us, the journalists. That hotel was the focus of a huge amount of attention because it was full of journalists and we all refused to stop reporting. In fact, I reported more. I was there to make a documentary for Channel 4. Excuse me, Dorothy, but I did also do Down the Lines for CNN every night, for Al Jazeera, and for everybody else, basically, for everybody who didn't have a crew, which was half the teams in the world.
So that was the report that you were doing, and then when you came back, tell us about how you came to be giving evidence to a court, because I don't think you ever thought anything like that would happen.
No, we didn't, but we knew that what we'd filmed was clearly important. We knew that we were among very few people who had this sort of footage. The ICC got in touch simply because they kind of went down the line. Obviously Associated Press and Reuters would kind of go before us, and they were on the ground for longer and filmed more stuff. But neither will take part, just as an organisational rule. So that footage was not available to them. I think what the ICC wanted from us was, as I say, just the physical proof, the visual proof that certain things happened in certain locations. We can't prove that a certain individual was killed there, but we can prove that there was a checkpoint there. We can prove that these boys who were on that checkpoint had their orders from a certain force and so on. So our footage was taken. I use this kind of divorce process. I wasn't massively involved. I probably would have agreed to it, but really what I got was an email saying we've had this wonderful offer from the SEC and we've sent off your footage, which included everything that we'd shot. I mean, Russia's raw footage, me making mistakes, me getting the French translation wrong, me misunderstanding and sort of turning to the camera, or you know, when you try clumsily as a reporter turn to the camera and you try to summarise not just what that person said, but why it's culturally important, why now, and you just kind of come off like an idiot. All of that stuff. They had it all. And then they kept on calling every year to sort of stay in touch, which I thought was just procedural, but it became apparent in the kind of last 18 months or so that they really mean this. They want me to come in and give evidence. And I quite naively assumed, for various reasons, I think because they told me, that that the focus was really going to be on the footage, and it was very much about explaining where we were, how we got that footage, who took us there, the logistics of it all, and that was that really. Nothing to worry about. I was specifically told actually not to revise. I don't know if this comes from your time, but there was this sense that I might be over-prepared, that my bosses might tell me to say or not say certain things, or it may come across or come out that I had been prepared in some way. So, you know, don't revise, don't speak to anybody involved, don't speak to your bosses, don't speak to...
Tell the truth.
Others, just tell the plain truth as it was. Problem with telling the plain truth when you've just been in quite a traumatic situation 6 years ago, which you kind of put into a box and then go on with your life, is that you then have to open that box and remember things accurately, which is the point of putting it in that box, is that you don't really want to or can't do that. So that was very, very tough on the stand. I did 2.5 days of giving evidence. I'm not sure why, but I think that they kind of... I think the things that I was saying, because I had absolutely no agenda whatsoever, I barely even researched this country after I left. It really did put it in a box and just, God, that was weird. I survived, and that was it. And then suddenly I was kind of having to recall these really, you know, quite harsh details about things that had happened, and be convincing about it, which
so it must have been very difficult to remember after 6 years, but are you glad that you gave evidence, and would you say to people that they should do it? What would you say?
The trial's not over yet, and this is not, we're talking about a case where, God, it's a really hard thing to say. It's almost like procedural war crimes, like they made some decisions and allowed some things to happen that got a bit out of hand for a while, and they're probably responsible for some terrible things. But we're not talking about concentration camps. We're not talking about like a whole kind of pyramid of cultural complicity where everybody's killing their own neighbours. It never got that bad. So, am I glad that I took part? I have to sort of ask myself if the professional and personal implications are really worth the historical implications, which I don't think are going to be huge, if I'm honest. Had I not taken part, I suspect if he's going to be found guilty, if they're going to be found guilty, then that would have happened anyway. And if I, really, I don't think my involvement is the crux of the matter. I feel like journalists in your position had a much more kind of crucial role to play. That's just me, and I think the reason for that is the personal implications. Obviously, as the reporter, as the on-screen person, as the person who's easily found on Facebook and so on, I get the hate mail from the defendant's fans, I get the stuff. I represent everything to do with a journalist, and I wasn't the only journalist either. In fact, there's another journalist who took part in the same trial a year before, but he's much harder to find apparently than I am. So they all come and get in touch with me and tell me what was wrong with his testimony as well. So that was very difficult. And then all that kind of questioning of everything, questioning of yourself and what you're there for, and whether or not you should be doing this. I should element regardless of either way. That there is a really important racial point as well, in that as a black Brit going to court in the ICC to give evidence against a black president of an African country who was revered. He's a Pan-Africanist, he's left-winger and all that. I probably would have voted for him if I was Ivorian, as a young socialisty kind of student. So there is that real sense of, God, did I sell my people out? Which is, they were right, you were a sellout, etc., etc. Did I not understand the political implications of what I was doing enough? Did I not think through the personal implications, perhaps, of what I was doing? But when it comes right down to it, the reason I did it is because I've been there, I saw things that I knew were wrong. Somebody asked me to come and talk about that, and it's, like you said, it's on record. We put out a documentary. If we'd had, it was a 25-minute documentary, if we'd had an hour-long slot from Dorothy here, we could make an hour-long documentary. We've done 90 minutes, they all say that. But the truth is we would have put out as much of that 40 hours of footage that they took from us as we could have done. And so when they gave me the opportunity to present it in a court and actually describe it and explain it, or and explain its relevance to their trial, and of course I took that opportunity. I was stupid not to. Well, that's what I felt at the time.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. You've heard there three journalists talk about it's really hard doing this in every way. You're attacked by the person is being prosecuted by other journalists, you're trolled, you question everything about yourself. Why should people give evidence if they're journalists?
Okay, 3 quick headlines, then some random thoughts, and then I'll shut up. The 3 headlines. First, I left a reasonably comfortable life as a barrister back in 2002 because I believed really passionately, following what had happened in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, that if people do really atrocious things, that they then ought to face justice, that the international community should try to do something to make those who are responsible take account of what they've done, and that there should be that old thing, punishment and reparations afterwards. I totally accept all of the criticisms that you'll all be familiar with the faults of the international justice system, some of which have been referred to a little bit earlier on this evening. It all takes far too long. It's very expensive. Not all that many cases go through, and one can go on and on and on. But having been on and off at the ICC for 9 years, I remain as committed to that process now as I was at the beginning. The sense that there is an institution there that will try to do something about it, if it can, I think is one of the testimonies to our humanity. So I'd ask you in all of this not to forget the importance of justice in all of this. If you can get it, you quite often fail, but if you can secure justice, that, in my view, has a very high value indeed. Point is, I've probably been a judge now for far too long, and it's time for me to shuffle off to a retirement home somewhere. But increasingly over the years, I have been struck by what seems to me to be a growing difficulty to get anybody to come along to give evidence. People don't care. They see something in the street, they will turn their head and get as far away as possible, as quickly as they can. You may be the victim of a horrible incident of domestic abuse. It's really difficult in those circumstances to give evidence. You may be part of a community that has been attacked, and you will be known as one of those who's gone to give evidence against the other side. That is excruciatingly difficult, and you run terrible risks. You may have, as I'm sure the witnesses we've heard from today, just simply have the most awful stage fright. I mean, it is really difficult giving evidence, and the result of this has been you feel as a judge that there's almost a dwindling pool of people who you can get to court actually to describe what has happened. Now, journalists, actually on the whole, tend to be very good witnesses. They are there to observe. That's the whole point of being there in the first place. So they're not just shattered by the fact that some dramatic event has happened which they weren't anticipating. They are there actually as witnesses. And of course there are no hard and fast rules. Every situation is different. But over the last 20 years while I've been a judge, I've been struck on a number of occasions by how good journalists are actually at being able to break down what has happened. Now, in a world where justice is important and where it is difficult to secure anyone to come along and talk about it, can we really say that one group of people can elect for some moral or ethical or other reason that we are not going to participate in this process? We are going to stand removed. I'm almost tempted to say aloof, but I think that's pejorative. But removed from this process, we will not contribute to securing justice. Well, I've asked the question. You will not be surprised at what is likely to be my answer. Now, I want to return, if I can, to the difficulties. I lament the fact that people are not provided with support. I lament the fact that they're given sometimes insufficient assistance in relation to how much or how little they should prepare. This has been very bad in the past, but I certainly at the time I was at the ICC, I believe that it is getting very substantially better. There was a victims and witnesses unit at that court who have provided, over the years of my involvement, some absolutely stunning support to people who were going to be going through the process. Figuratively holding their hand, explaining to them what is going to happen, ensuring to the greatest extent that we could that when they had to return home after their evidence was finished, that they would be protected to the extent that we were able to do that. And I think even if employers don't get that right, the ICC is taking every step that it can to secure the well-being of those who are prepared to go through the process. Those are the headlines, one or two random thoughts, and I'm then going to shut up. The first is, in the Lubanga trial, which was the trial over which I presided, the most critical evidence was video footage taken of the accused at public events at which child soldiers were present. I can't say what the reaction would have been of my two fellow judges, but for myself, if that evidence hadn't been there, I think it would have been much more difficult to have arrived at a verdict which was adverse to Lubanga. That footage put in place everything else that was there. And that is exactly the kind of film footage of which we have heard earlier. It is key and crucial in so many cases that you've got a visual record of what happened. The thing that is perhaps to be regretted is that the unfortunate cameraman or woman or journalist then has to go along to give evidence to provide context in relation to what they filmed. But let us not forget how important that particular material is. Last thought. I think more imaginative things can be done about the ways in which evidence is given. At the moment, it's played out too much like a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in a huge Olympic-style court that is very intimidating. We tried something at the ICC which was having evidence being given by way of deposition, with both sides being represented in a much quieter, much more muted, much more familiar surroundings, with that testimony being recorded and then being assimilated into the proceedings and forming part of our verdict. And I think ways should be found in which we can make the process of giving evidence far less intimidating than it is. Now, over.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I mentioned before that Wayne has been an advocate at the ICC, but you've been an advocate in many international criminal courts in many places, Cambodia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and what would be your advice and your thoughts to journalists here who are thinking maybe one day should I do that?
Well, I'm going to disagree largely, or at least partly, with certainly with Adrian, and probably a little with the journalists who have given evidence, or who have spoken today. I think, well, two points I think are important to me. Number one, that the function of a journalist as a watchdog has been crucial for many years, but is particularly crucial now. And I think it sits to some degree in contradistinction to the role of a journalist giving evidence. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And the second thing I think is relevant to the question of what role journalists should play and whether it should be in the courtroom or not is the value of their evidence if they do give evidence. And frankly, it's actually quite low. It's actually not that valuable. Now, that's not to say the report that what they produce in terms of the writing or in terms of the photographs, and Wendy will talk about the app that she's got that she uses to take photographs in real time or soon after the events, and so the photographs are critical, but the journalist's testimony is less so. So what I say is, if there's anything which detracts significantly or even slightly from the function of a journalist as a watchdog, I would say we should be very careful about damaging that function. Now, it's kind of a paradox in a way that in an era of cameras and an era of free flow of information, that the role of the journalist remains so important, well, the watchdog function of the journalist remains so important, and in fact I think more important than it's ever been. It's much more difficult in some ways, I think, for evidence to come out of these conflict situations which really pinpoints or identifies the role of the leadership. Syria and chemical weapons. Of course, there's fairly good evidence that the regime uses chemical weapons, but the regime is also very good at misinformation, disinformation, and we see this in conflicts around the world. Ukraine, Putin, very good at suggesting that Russia is not involved in the east, very good at suggesting when Crimea was taking over that there was no Russian troops in Crimea. And so, despite the free flow of information, despite the ubiquity of cameras and so on, I think it's very difficult for news, accurate information to emerge from these conflicts. And journalists play an absolutely vital role in getting that information out. And the second thing I think about how vital it is for journalists to continue playing that role is our attention span. The news cycle moves very fast these days, and my organisation, for example, we represent 400 Rohingya women, and our biggest problem in trying to set up a viable defence for them is finding funds. And the reason it's very difficult to find funds is because after a concentrated period of news, everybody moves on. How often do we hear about the Rohingyas now? We had 6 months ago, we had quite a bit of good news about their fate and what has happened to them. And the crimes against them are the worst I've seen in the last 20 years against any group. And yet, where are they in the news cycle? We need journalists to keep things in the news cycle, because if they're not in the news cycle, then the sympathy for that situation diminishes, the empathy diminishes, and the activity in support of their humanitarian situation diminishes. The money available to pursue accountability for them also diminishes. And so without journalists playing this vital watchdog function, actually the pursuit of human rights, activism, human rights accountability becomes very difficult. And Ed made the point about, I think with some cynicism as to whether his work had any impact, but I suspect even younger ones amongst you will have seen some of those photographs. The photograph of the man, or the video footage of the man with emaciated form in front of the barbed wire, I saw that when I was in my 20s, and it's stuck with me ever since. And I have no doubt the footage that Ed produced and the work he and his fellow journalists did was vital to the setting up of the ICTY. I'm absolutely convinced of it. And those photographs have played through trial after trial after trial, and they've been extremely powerful in terms of setting a tone and setting an atmosphere. Less so the testimony of the journalists, I would say. And there's a reason for that. International criminal trials are made up of two forms of evidence, essentially. Crime-based evidence and linkage evidence. Crime-based evidence is what it says. It creates it's the evidence which shows the pattern of crimes at the ground level. It's context. And context is important. If you're prosecuting a crime against humanity, you need to prove that there was an attack on the civilian population and it was widespread or systematic. But ultimately, it's context, and ultimately, in most cases, that is not a seriously contested proposition. The vital evidence is linkage evidence. It's the evidence of insiders and accomplices who are inside the organisations who are able to point the finger at the people above them until the chain goes to the top. Journalists, generally speaking, fall somewhere closer to crime-based evidence. They're providing context evidence. Of course, their evidence is more distinct. It creates a flavour in the trial, but in terms of its probative value, it's not linkage evidence. It doesn't generally point to a particular person having committed a crime. And it's certainly not pointing to a person, and it's certainly not evidence which is irreplaceable or cannot reasonably be obtained from other sources. So it's not evidence which is vital to either the final judgment, but it's not even, in most instances, vital to any core issue, because there is evidence which is can replace it. So it's rare that it stands somehow distinct, even if the accused confesses to a journalist. It's unlikely to be the only evidence of confession. If an accused is at the time talking to journalists, admitting his crimes, is likely he's admitting his crimes in military documents, security documents, and so on. If he's that boastful about what he's doing, he's boasting in many different situations. And finally, and then I will shut up, in terms of what the judges can do with the evidence, it's also hampered because journalists will not want to reveal their sources, and for very good reasons. Now, of course, in certain instances they may have to, but only when the public interest is overriding will a court order a journalist to disclose the sources for very good reasons. I don't need to explain them. Which means, of course, that a journalist may give an account of what happened or what he was told or what she was told, but will not be prepared to reveal their sources, and therefore a judge cannot take that evidence and rely upon it to the same extent as they could if the sources were revealed. And in that sense, it's got the makings of expert testimony, but it isn't expert testimony, because if you have an expert report or expert evidence, then it's well substantiated by sources, and the witness will be required to discuss those sources and justify how they came to the conclusion based on those sources. So it's closer to crime-based, it's not linkage, and it's not expert evidence. And so, in the end, it's a moment in the trial for sure, but it's not significant to the final result. And let me just say one last thing, and I really appreciate what the journalists have said here about the degree of vulnerability that is felt when they give evidence. And as somebody who's prosecuted but also defended, it's our job as advocates to spot that vulnerability and to, how can I put this without sounding terribly cynical, but it's our job to spot the vulnerability and expose it and exploit it. Because no matter what I've just said about the evidence not ending up generally being particularly probative, you can't take that risk at the moment when the journalist comes. So it's your job as an advocate to take that vulnerability and to make sure you use it to the best effect. And when I've seen journalists give evidence in courtrooms, they are, of course, coming there with, if I can put it crudely, with a dog in the fight. They've seen things, they want to testify, they're close to the subject. It makes them vulnerable because that gives the advocate the tools by which they can undermine their testimony, and it will never be a pleasant experience, even with judges such as Adrian, who will protect those witnesses. The rules of advocacy are wide enough to allow vulnerabilities to be exploited and for that experience to be a difficult one.
Wow. So, I'll come back to you briefly, if I may. So we play a vital role, but we're really of no use in court. Adrian.
Yeah, there's a bit of a difference in perception, I'm
I've
afraid.
spotted that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key for me in this is there are just simply no hard and fast rules. There's no one situation in which a journalist is giving evidence. It's infinitely varies. It may be long after the event. It may be you're giving evidence of hearsay that's third hand. On the other hand, you may be there when critical events are taking place. I mean, I think that was part of the narrative that we heard a bit earlier. You may be hearing phenomenally valuable hearsay evidence immediately after the incident, where lead players are talking to you about what has happened in circumstances that makes what they say likely to be believed by a court. You may be filming stuff which is just simply irreplaceable in the trial process. So I just don't think one can pigeonhole journalistic evidence as being in some way in a particular category of lesser evidence. It may be relatively unimportant, it may be thunderingly vital in terms of a court understanding what's happened. And so I think one has got to look at this in a very nuanced and subtle way and not try just to pigeonhole this as being one thing.
Thank you. Now I'm going to come to Wendy Betts now, and Wendy, as I say, is the Director of Eyewitness to Atrocities, and she's going to tell us about something very exciting about new ways of evidence being gathered and that we potentially as journalists may be involved in and certainly should know about. That is vital in bringing people to book.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to tell you a bit about Eyewitness to Atrocities and how it came about, what the app is, what it does, and then talk a bit about its relevance to journalists. And I'd like to think that it is one of those imaginative ways that Adrian was talking about of bringing evidence to bear in court when it's difficult to get witnesses and it's difficult to get access to information. So Eyewitness to Atrocities is an organization that provides a mobile camera app to activists, journalists, other individuals to collect photos and videos of information related to war crimes, other serious international crimes, but in a way that allows that information to stand up in investigations in trials, more so than you could with a standard mobile camera. So this project began in 2011, and we started to see so much footage showing up on social media, filmed by people with smartphones in conflict zones, other places experiencing large-scale human rights violations, And while the content of the footage indeed seemed to show criminal conduct, really without knowing the provenance of the footage, there was very little you could do with it. So it was playing an incredibly important role in raising awareness of events that we may otherwise not have known. But then the next question was, so can we use it in court? Can we use it to hold the perpetrators of these horrific acts accountable? And the answer is by and large no. And the reasons for that are ones that you're probably familiar with the fake news discussion. You don't know with any certainty where and when this footage was captured. It's difficult to know with any certainty whether it's been edited, even if it was intact and accurate when uploaded, who's had access to it since then before it makes its way to the court, who could have made any changes to it. And so it's very difficult for it to have any evidentiary value. So what we set out to do is create a tool that activists, journalists, individual citizens could use to collect this information in much the same way, this very key first-hand, real-time information, but in a way that it could have a second life, not only raising awareness, but then going on to help promote justice and accountability. So we designed the Eyewitness app, and what it does is basically address those shortcomings. It collects information about where and when the footage was captured. It collects this geotagged information from 3 independent sources, none of which are the user themselves. It stores it together with the photos or videos in a way that can't be manipulated. It ensures that the footage can't be edited, so that when it makes its way to the court, it's the raw footage. And we have designed the system so that it protects the chain of custody. So everything is captured and encrypted and stored securely on the app. It's transmitted directly from the app, encrypted to a server that we maintain as the Eyewitness organization. And then we have access to that information in a way that's monitored and secured so that we can create logs and other information that you would find like any other evidence locker. And so it's that system that helps the information become easier to authenticate so you can use it in court. One other feature of the Eyewitness app is it's designed that you can use it anonymously. So if you don't want your identity revealed, but you do want to capture the information and have it go forward for accountability, you can do so. I know that any court in the world will always prefer to have the photographer testify to enter that information into evidence, but it's not always necessary, and again, it depends on what the evidence is being entered in to prove and how controversial it is, but it is an option. Beyond the app, though, I want to stress that what Eyewitness does is provide this overall cycle of information. So we're providing a tool for individuals to collect the information to get it out of the country, then we're creating a chain of custody for it, but then we are also curating it and preparing it to be inserted into investigations. So all the footage is seen by a staff of attorneys, everything is cataloged, everything is tagged, then everything is curated into dossiers to make it more effective for investigators to absorb it and use it. You have investigators who are very time pressed. They can't be scouring the internet constantly for every piece of footage. They can't be going to every civil society organization and conflict zone to see what they might have. So we tried to work to bridge that gap between the first responders on the ground collecting this information and putting it in a format that can be inserted into investigations more easily. So in terms of journalists and how this is relevant to you, majority of the app users are human rights defenders, but when we designed it, the idea we had was we would target individuals who had set out purposefully to document information, and we looked at human rights defenders and we looked at journalists. But as we went along, we started to realize they are quite distinct user profiles, and there's different workflow and there's different sensitivities involved. So when we came to work with journalists, one issue that did come up and still comes up regularly is this idea of neutrality, is this idea of protecting your mandate. So some journalists don't want to be seen with an app that is specifically there to gather evidence because their access may depend on the parties that they're embedded with. And if they can't have that access, they can't fulfill the role that Wayne's talking about, where they're reporting on things that we otherwise wouldn't know, and they're fulfilling that watchdog function. So that is one issue. On the other hand, we do work with journalists who want the information to go forward. They want it to have a second life. The point that Ed made, that getting the information out there sometimes doesn't move the ball forward. So we want to have a second opportunity to use that information to make a meaningful change. One is that the sheer volume of footage that you take doesn't necessarily correspond with the usability when you're using a tool that is trying to encrypt things, trying to store things securely, trying to ensure that things have to be transmitted to a secure repository before it can be shared. So there's connectivity issues, there's storage issues that come up just with that workflow. So we developed some creative ways that journalists can incorporate it into their workflow. It's not intended to be something that replaces how journalists work. But another point to make that I think relates to some of what Wayne was saying is that there's pros and cons of trying to collect evidence when you're a non-professional investigator, such as a journalist. So some of the pros are the access is phenomenal. As Shay mentioned, he's the only one who had seen some of these events, filmed some of these events, the Lubanga footage. There's very important access that journalists have that investigators absolutely don't, and you don't want to lose that opportunity to collect that information. The idea that the information that you collect is very relevant, it's very thorough. As was said, you're there to listen, you're there to observe, you're there to record what's happening, and so you do have a large picture of what's going on, and you have a platform to get that information out. So those are all key roles to be played. On the other hand, collecting evidence is a vastly different skill set than telling a story in journalism, and even the way you frame shots, what you're filming, may not be what would be most useful in a case. So we were working with a group of journalists and we gave them training on how do you film a crime scene and how do you collect information that could be useful for a case. And so we set up a mock scene and we sent the journalists in and said, okay, walk us through what you would film. And the answer was, well, we'll film the most compelling shot, which is absolutely right for getting public's attention and reporting. It's absolutely not right for collecting something that's trying to prove where items were in the scene and what the relevant distance was and who is responsible. And so it's a very specialized skill. The other difficulties come with, again, protecting the chain of custody. It's not necessarily feasible for you to be taking your SD card and putting it in a plastic bag and wrapping it up with tape and locking it in a safe in case those pictures might be used 10, 15, 40 years from now. And then the legal curation. So again, what might be relevant to an attorney, what might be relevant to the court, may not be the same footage that you think is most important for a story. And so of all the footage that you have, it's difficult for you to pick what a court might want to know or for you to know what to say. And again, back to the point that Shay made, that the court soaked up every minute of that footage that was taken, regardless if it was an outtake, regardless if it was a mistake. And some of the key images might even have been in some of that aspects and not what actually made the documentary. And so it's difficult for you to know what is the most relevant piece of information that you have. And so I think this is where there is room for Eyewitness to be a tool for journalists, because we can bridge some of those gaps. So in terms of just the added layer of credibility that a tool like Eyewitness can give in terms of verifying where and when it was taken, ensuring it hasn't been edited, and help closing down that line of criticism that you might get if you are testifying to get that footage in to court. It helps to bolster that. We also, again, take on the responsibility of the chain of custody. So we have a master copy that can be used in court, and we can vouch for who's had access to it and ensure that it stays pristine. But then I think also importantly is this curation role. So as I mentioned at the outset, we try to bridge that gap between the people who collected the information and how it can be used. So we work with investigators and we work with lawyers in national and international judicial mechanisms. We work with investigator and non-judicial mechanisms and can help make sure that that information is sourced to the jurisdiction that can make the most use of it and can have the most impact.
Thank you. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I'd really like to understand more about that. No, they were so gripping. I had to let everybody talk at some length, but are there brief points and questions people would like to make? And it's up to you if you want to say who you are and whether you're a journalist.
No, I'm joking.
I think you're a journalist.
I was with the BBC as a correspondent, and I think it's shameful that the BBC didn't pay Jackie's hotel expenses. They can stand back from the trial itself. But can I ask Ed a question? Because very specifically, after your reports, there was a lot of attacking of the reports in the mainstream media before. I mean, it started with Marxism Today, and then I think it got into the Times, didn't it? There were a lot of questions as to whether this was a concentration camp, which side of the wire they were, all this sort of nonsense. And we're going to see a lot more of that in the years now because of fake news and what the Russians are doing, the great piles of ordure that are being poured on journalism from around the world, Russia and China in particular. And I just wonder if you could talk about whether, you said it didn't really change things as much as you hoped it had, exposing concentration camps in Europe in 1992. We still had to go through years of killing. I wonder if the attacks by other journalists affected the impact that you might otherwise have had.
Thanks, David, a lot. I've got so much raised, I'm going to have to be quick and less than boringly discursive before. I mean, it's also, this picks up very much from what Wendy's doing. I mean, I tried to blather on about why I decided to testify, why I stuck with it. You have to get your Monty Python right. It was living Marxism. It came out of The Hague, actually, at the defence of the first defendant, when suddenly these people called living Marxism, quite well established within the media. I mean, one of them had, as you say, a column in the Times. They have names: Claire Fox, Mick Hume. They were later picked up by Noam Chomsky and various others. Decided that we fabricated the camps. And if you Google ITN, Trinopolie, Volume, Guardian, you'll see the picture that fooled the world. I mean, this is what my generation calls revisionism. Most of you would call fake news. They're related, they're cousins, and they're toxic, they're poisonous. The way I stuck with it, actually, was because to standards that would satisfy both of you despite your disagreement in court. It wasn't a matter of on the one hand, on the other. Harold Evans, let's have a media debate between living Marxism and myself and ITN. No, there's nothing to debate, was the argument. And actually, a court of law can settle that issue a lot more than any effing media debate. As the mass graves kept being found, and they still are around the camps, with hundreds of people in them. Occasionally I write to Professor Chomsky and say, what exactly did I get? He says, you got involved in a story that was probably not true. What was not true? And if it wasn't true, who's in the mass graves? Professor Chomsky, he never replies. But the fact is that, for all your reservations and your estimable encouragements, thank you. We can disagree with judgments, but the fact is that the ICTY established what Ulmaska and Trinopolie were in the context of the mass graves and the testimony that the victims and the chain of command established, because you get victims and you have to take it up to the top, as you say. That's why, to get back to the personal stuff that we tried to convey to you, three of us, Jackie so movingly, especially, we know why we went into it. That's why I stuck with it, because it wasn't actually the middle managers of genocide, as I call them, kept me awake at night. It was these bastards sitting in their armchairs at MIT and blathering on Radio 4, and they still are, who actually had the temerity to say that we made it up. I didn't care so much about the sleep I was losing over there, but what does that do to the survivors and the memory of the dead? What's it like for someone who survived those rape camps and who survived the rest of it to be told he didn't have it? The doctor on there, Idris, who lives in Hamburg now, near Lübeck, just near Hamburg, he says, I said, what do you say to these people who say that, it didn't happen? I have no words. I tried to find words to describe what happened to us in the camp for the court and for the interview with you, but I have no words for that. And that's what I think we do, actually. I have to, thank you for reminding me if I sounded, it's not cynicism, it's exhaustion. Please don't make me sound as though, I think I'm important. There should be a special court in hell for journalists who think they're important in my view. But
can I preside it?
Yeah, you'll find there's a lot of life sentences. But there was one of the guys who was running the camp. Talk about, went back in '96 in the snow. Who was running that? We met them all before we went in. Who were these people? And this one, they all, no, it was all media fabrication. You have seen the papers. You've read Mickey in the Times. Oh yeah, well, actually, I was here. I couldn't say that. There was one guy running a hospital, Kovacevic, he was called. 9 o'clock in the morning, he drank 2/3 of a bottle of brandy, got drunk. The room was steaming. And, shorthand, by the way, is the kind of our version of Wendy's app. It's admissible in court, as far as I know. He was steaming, and he confessed. And he hadn't confessed before, and he never did again. He denied the conversation happened. But the shorthand was in the book, had to be sent away to be decoded. That's pretty hairy as well. So actually, it was that kept us going, because by then, these people were saying, we made it up. And he was the guy running the damn camp saying, they did it. In court. I mean, the shorthand on that. So actually, sometimes we're not as useless as.
Thank you.
And Wendy's, of course, is all part of this, because once it's there, and it's time-coded, and it's curated, and it's chain of custody, and all that stuff, then living marks are going to go to hell. Once Wendy's.
I think it was bankrupted, actually. They went down.
They're still around, they're fine.
Really? Oh, yeah.
They're
So, yes.
They're called the Institute of Ideas. Claire Fox,
Yes.
listen to her on Radio 4.
Oh.
Thank you, everyone. Very compelling witness-bearing and testimony, and really, really fascinating food for thought. I'm a journalist and an author. I'm Hadani Ditmars. I wrote a book on pre- and post-invasion Iraq called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone. And I actually had a video camera, and I went on the PR tour led by Janice Karpinski 8 months before the scandal broke at Abu Ghraib prison, and with many other people in the international press corps and media. And there was a scary prison doctor who was there. We've been there before, and anyway, it's in my book. But I was actually asked to show some of my video footage to Francis Boyle at the University of Illinois when I was a resident there. And anyway, I'm not sure if it made a difference or not, but I just did it because I felt compelled to. But in listening to all this, and I mean, I was so moved by the Balkan stories, and just really feel for you, and I'm so grateful that it's almost was like church for journalists or something, that you were able to share that. And I'm going to Iraq again, so I'm thinking about all these things now. But historically, who's to say what can make a difference or not? I mean, it's almost a philosophical question more than a legal. Well, it is a legal one too, but I mean, for instance, Indonesia, there was a people's tribunal just a few years ago to try and address the legacy of the massacres. But I wonder, the communist purges, etc. I wonder if there had been an app then, if there had been an ICC then, if there had been journalists on the ground then that could somehow share their information, would it have made a difference historically or not? So that's my
Thank you. So I've got time for a few more points, and please try to be brief so that as many people as possible. You can blether a bit, but
I'm a journalist, a Mexican journalist, and I'm also a PhD researcher at Goldsmiths University. So I want to address this issue about new ways or imaginative ways of presenting evidence at court or in trials. And that just reminded me of the work that Forensic Architecture is doing. Is an advocacy, a group of journalists and architects. So the borderline just between a journalist and an activist is a bit blurred. But anyway, they're creating some evidence, and I think just the work they're doing is just in between testimonies and this kind of fetishization of this subjective evidence used in trials. Yeah. So what they're doing is just creating these 3D models. For instance, this prison in Syria, so Naya is called. So just the testimony and footage or the evidence, the objective evidence, is kind of mixed and is kind of the same thing. So I was wondering if just the creation of this evidence, these 3D models, this footage that is created in a sense, could be used in these international courts. Do you see people at court using this as evidence?
I think that's too big a question on which to give some kind of definitive answer. It sounds very interesting would encourage lawyers, journalists, anyone, academics, to come up with ideas as to how we can better get evidence into trial proceedings, because I think the old, Tom and Jerry slogging it out in court in front of a packed public gallery is not the best way of doing it, and there are other ways of testing evidence and assessing it, and we need to get cleverer at it. 3D, possibly, but let's have a chat about that on another occasion.
Okay, a couple more points, yes. And if people could try to be really brief, sorry.
I'm Molly Allen. I'm a member of the public, but I also happen to be the mum of Karen Allen, the BBC foreign correspondent, who has been working in Africa for the past 12 years. Her first 4 years were spent in Kenya, where she covered the 2007 election, covering the pre-election public and the actual election, and most importantly, the post-election violence. Following that, she obtained credible evidence that the post-election violence was actually initiated by people high up in the administration with the help of the Munguki gang, which is a kind of mafia organization. And she prepared a documentary which was broadcast on News Night in August of that year. Following that report, all the local reporters, the local journalists who had known about this involvement of high officials had not dared to publish anything, but on the morning after the news strike report, all the papers in Kenya reported about the event. But the worrying aspect is that people who would have attended as witnesses suddenly disappeared, never to be heard of again. Then subsequently, when Uhuru Kenyatta was indicted by the ICC invited my daughter to come as a witness. And she wrote to me a couple of weeks ago when I mentioned that I was coming to a nice meeting, and she said, "Mummy, you can share this information with this meeting." She said, "I was urged to be an ICC witness and was approached by investigators, but chose not to because I thought it would compromise the neutrality journalists seek to represent, and also compromise sources. And because I work for a British news organization, my participation could have fed into the narrative that the ICC is white men's justice. I chose to make my contribution to my academic work, and in particular used Kenya to expose the limitations of the court, which personally is an institution I very much support."
Thank you. Right, well, that was a very interesting intervention. Yes? And please try to be brief.
A quick question for Wendy and one for Wayne. The evidence that you're accumulating through your app, which sounds like a very interesting idea, is there not a risk that you'll be seen as building the prosecution case for them, or at least investigating it? And a second question for Wayne, which is, as a defending in these cases, where you have the vast amounts of footage which will be presented to you, how do you go about challenging the integrity of that footage, especially where you're talking about anonymous witnesses with what could be very important footage in the likes of the Myanmar situation?
Okay, now can you very, very briefly each try to answer that? And the next person, if you put your hand up, who might want to speak. Okay, but very briefly, Wendy.
I would say to the criticism that we're building the prosecution's cases, one, we actually aren't investigating the entirety of the case. So these are very complex crimes that require a significant amount of evidence of varying types on varying issues. So Wayne mentioned the crime base, the linkage, so you need witnesses, you need documents, you need photos, you need a variety, you need forensics. So we're collecting some photos on certain aspects that can be incorporated in, but it's not the full case. So we're not commissioning an actual case. It isn't a situation of the prosecution outsourcing their investigations to us.
Thank you. Wayne?
I mean, the simple answer is you don't go trying to challenge the footage. And it goes back to my question of how vital the footage is, and how vital the evidence is producing the footage. The best thing to do is not to challenge footage like what Ed produced and pretend that somehow the concentration camp didn't exist. You have to find a way to break the link between the concentration camp, which certainly did exist, and your client. And there'll be ample evidence of which supports the existence of the concentration camp. There'll be victim after victim after victim. There'll be human rights reports, and there'll be linkage witnesses who say, I worked at the camp. And then there'll be the footage. But the footage is really, in many ways, for a good prosecutor, it's the icing on the cake. It's not the cake. So trying to undermine the footage doesn't really take you very far.
Thank you. Here.
I'm a lawyer, but my comment relates to more in the direction of praising journalism more than courts. It's a response
we
to
like that.
It's a response to both Adrian's and Wayne's interventions there. And it just struck me that when one hears defences of things to do in the face of horrific events, the way that the courts are defended and the way that the judicial project is defended is very often by reference to the idea of humanity per se, the idea of justice per se, the idea of doing a good thing, whereas defences of journalism are often defended simply for their own sake. I think that's a shame. I think it indicates how, as a political project, as an option that's chosen at court, or the idea of law as a response to politics, tends to crowd out other options. I think it's worth thinking about what the real function of both processes might be. You might call it something like politicisation or the examination of facts. And when Ed was talking about his photograph, which I must say is imprinted on my mind in a way which is similar to the way it is with Wayne's. I'm far, this may be my own ignorance or naivety about commentary on this, but I personally am dramatically, and I didn't know about the Chomsky intervention until tonight actually, but I'm dramatically more aware of the photograph than of the critique. Whereas when a court is the thing that's dealing with the facts, politicising them and examining them, if an advocate can successfully destroy a witness, the remainder of that is what the judge thinks of it. And I'd far rather have the consensus being arrived at through the broad, diffuse nature of the impression that I've been left with of a photograph than I would from an international court, which doesn't necessarily can't be understood to represent a coherent society. So I think that there's something about law which crowds out other options. There's something about courts which tends to diminish the inherent value of something like journalism. I think that's a shame.
Thank you. A point here at the back. Briefly, please.
I'm Richard Neal, I'm a freelance journalist. I've spent a lot of time in South Sudan. I just wanted to take up Wayne's point about journalists and watchdogs. And I was slightly unclear whether you were saying that a journalist giving testimony in a court actually diminishes their power as a watchdog, because I wonder whether that's true. Regimes committing atrocities aren't necessarily going to stop committing atrocities because they think a journalist will appear in court. I don't think that necessarily makes a difference.
Want to briefly respond to that?
I mean, I have no data to suggest that journalists giving evidence in trials diminishes their functions as watchdogs, but it seems to me anecdotally and logically that there's a risk of that, and I think we live in times when journalists are increasingly attacked by despots and authoritarian regimes. Why take the risk, given the importance of the watchdog function? Why take the risk of closing down access? Don't we need to do everything we can to protect journalists and keep their access as broad as possible? Because if we lose that, we lose too much, I think. So, I mean, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I can see why, if ICRC is a good example, there's a very good reason that they have absolute privilege, so they can do their job. And I think there's a reason why human rights reporting also has a qualified privilege. I think that there is a recognition that the public interest has to be protected, and if sometimes you err on the side of caution to protect the interest which is so significant, then we should err on the side of caution, especially in light of, and I think this, going back to my thesis that the evidence doesn't turn out to be very important. We can test this because we can look in the judgments, and actually the judgments where, I think Ed's evidence, I don't know about Jackie's because I haven't come across the testimony before, but Ed's, I've seen that testimony, and I think it was much more important testimony than other journalists, I think, and there was a reason for that. Number one, he had really good access. Number two, it was in the early stages of the IC2Y that he became involved. And as to the access point, he did sit down with some of the critical characters. But I don't think, in the main, journalist evidence reaches that kind of probative value, which, when comparing the public interest and the value in them giving testimony, no accused will be convicted on the basis of a journalist evidence. They'll be convicted on the basis of incremental, brick by brick, paper by paper, crime-based plus linkage. It's a melange. It's not a single piece of evidence, and there's no accused that's been convicted on the basis of a single piece of journalist evidence. In fact, I'd venture to say, in the modern tribunals, there's an accused has not been. There's not been a single piece of journalism, perhaps maybe other than Ed's, which has gone to has had such a high value in terms of core issues. That might be putting it a bit strong, but I can't think of any.
Now, I'm going to ask Ed to say a few words at the end. Now, before I do, there's a point that Shane made to me earlier that we haven't touched on, which is if journalists do decide that they want to give evidence, that we as journalists have to find ways of supporting and helping each other better. And I think that is something that anybody here who does think journalists should give evidence, I would ask you to go away and think about how journalists can give that support to each other, so that the journalist isn't just relying on themselves, their employer and the court. But Ed, you've heard a lot here about why you should, why you shouldn't. Is our evidence really worth anything? What is it, all this made, what do you take away from this debate tonight?
Can I defer to Jackie?
Well, Ed, you have far more experience with the ICTY than I. I only did one case, you did about 9, didn't you?
Well, there are two things really. I mean, one is, I mean, we're talking about 25 years ago in this instance. I just hope that Wendy can't talk about her cases, but I just hope that some of them are in Syria, because everything that David raised applies equally if you Google chlorine gas white helmets and this grotesque revision that is occurring now. I was at a festival the other day about engaged music, and the sessions on Syria was all just, I want to talk to you about the liberation of Aleppo, on and on. So, let's just, that is now out of our control, and it's going to be a combination of the app and the courts, I hope, that sort of sort that out. As regards things, I mean, sorry, I sounded too weary, if you are of an age and you're up for this, and most of you seem to be, go for it, absolutely. I mean, even if one thinks you're not going to make much difference, the judge is going to listen to you. Maybe you can something to download onto your phone.
I'll treat you very kindly.
I mean, I'm not. Journalists aren't lawyers. Lawyers win a case, if you advocate, you win a case or you lose it. We don't, and I think there's in a way we talk about impact and whether it matters or not. I mean, this sounds like a I really do want to defer to Jackie on the general point.
No, women are not going to defer to
okay.
you, just
well,
on this one.
Well, I mean, Dr. Rieu is my hero that, in Albert Camus' novel The Plague. He just treats people with plague. And he knows that they're probably going to die of it. And he may save one or two. But he does it for a reason that at the end he says is for a reason that I cannot imagine. You know, it's what, you know, the late great Marie Colvin said. It's what we do. And to me, that's enough, really. You know, if you stop the war in Bosnia, which we didn't, that doesn't stop you going to Sarajevo. If you don't make any, if your evidence is no good, it doesn't stop you testifying. You go. It's what we do.
Well, thank you very much, and to all our speakers.